I'm Sarah Michelle Thompson, 29 years old, standing in the sterile white corridors of Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, holding a folder that could change my life forever. The fluorescent lights hum overhead as I make my way to conference room ALPHA 7, where the most important meeting of my career is about to begin. My heart pounds against my ribs as I adjust my crisp NASA polo shirt, the same uniform I've worn for 3 years as a junior aerospace engineer, but today feels different. Today they're announcing the final crew selection for the Mars exploration mission, humanity's first crewed journey to the Red Planet. The irony isn't lost on me as I walk these halls. 13 years ago, in a small community center in Millbrook, Ohio, my father looked at my science fair project about Martian soil composition and said the words that would echo in my mind for over a decade. "Sarah, honey, you're not smart enough for this kind of thing. Maybe you should focus on something more realistic." The sting of those words still burns, but now they fuel something else entirely. Now they fuel the fire that got me here, to the threshold of making history. My reflection catches in the polished glass doors as I approach the conference room. Brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, minimal makeup, and the same determined expression I've worn since high school, when everyone back home thought my dreams were too big for a girl from a town where the biggest excitement was Friday night football. The folder in my hands contains not just my personnel file, but the culmination of 13 years of proving that small-town girl wrong, proving my father wrong, proving everyone who ever doubted me wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story really begins in Millbrook, Ohio, a town where cornfields stretch beyond the horizon, and the most ambitious career anyone could imagine was teaching at the local high school, or maybe making it to middle management at the factory 2 towns over. Population 15,000 on a good day, Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where traditions ran deep, and where dreaming too big was considered a character flaw, rather than an admiration-worthy trait. I grew up in a modest ranch house on Maple Street, where the paint peeled slightly around the window frames, and the front porch creaked under the weight of summer evenings spent watching neighbors walk their dogs. My father, Robert Thompson, taught algebra and geometry at Millbrook High School, a position he'd held for 22 years, with the kind of steady reliability that made him a pillar of the community. Dad was the type of man who believed in hard work, practical choices, and keeping your feet firmly planted on the ground. Mom, Linda, worked as the school nurse, tending to scraped knees and stomachaches with the same gentle efficiency she brought to our dinner table every night at 6 sharp. Our family dinners were predictable affairs, the 4 of us gathered around the same oak table Dad had inherited from his parents. My older brother Michael, 32 now, was the golden child who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. He'd followed a sensible path through mechanical engineering at Ohio State, landed a solid job at a manufacturing company, married his college sweetheart, and bought a house 3 streets away from where we grew up. Michael represented everything Dad believed success should look like: practical, achievable, and rooted in the familiar soil of home. My younger sister Jennifer, 26, had chosen marketing as her career path, which Dad considered acceptably ambitious for a daughter. She worked for a regional advertising firm, drove a lease car that impressed the neighbors, and dated a guy who sold insurance. Jen had mastered the art of pursuing goals that stretched her abilities without threatening anyone's comfort zone, and family gatherings always showcased her latest professional victories with pride. Then there was me, the middle child, who had always been just a little too curious, a little too intense, a little too interested in things that couldn't be found within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook. From the time I could walk, I'd been fascinated by the night sky, spending hours on our back porch with a cheap telescope Mom had bought at a garage sale. While other kids collected dolls or played house, I collected rocks and insisted they might be meteorites, much to Dad's amused exasperation. The turning point came during my sophomore year at Millbrook High School, when Mrs. Elena Rodriguez arrived as our new physics teacher. Dr. Rodriguez had moved to Ohio from California after her husband got a job at the regional hospital, and she brought with her an energy and passion for science that felt electric in our sleepy hallways. Unlike the other teachers who had learned to manage expectations for small-town students, Dr. Rodriguez talked about quantum mechanics during lunch, brought in real NASA photographs to illustrate concepts, and spoke about space exploration as if it were not just possible but inevitable for anyone willing to work hard enough. Under her guidance, I threw myself into physics with the intensity of someone who had finally found their calling. Dr. Rodriguez stayed after school to help me work through advanced problems, lent me college-level textbooks, and introduced me to online courses that pushed my understanding far beyond what Millbrook High could offer. She saw something in me that I was only beginning to recognize in myself, and she nurtured it with the kind of mentorship that changes lives. When the annual science fair approached during my junior year, Dr. Rodriguez suggested I tackle something ambitious, something that would challenge both my research skills and my ability to communicate complex ideas to a general audience. After weeks of consideration, I decided to focus on Martian soil composition and its implications for potential human colonization. The project required me to study spectroscopic analysis, understand the chemical processes that had shaped Mars over billions of years, and theorize about how future astronauts might use local resources to sustain human life on another planet. For 3 months, I lived and breathed that project. I spent every spare moment in the school library, every evening researching online, every weekend conducting experiments with soil samples to demonstrate my theories about how Martian regolith might be processed for construction materials and life support systems. I built detailed models, created comprehensive charts, and wrote a research paper that Dr. Rodriguez said rivaled undergraduate work she'd seen at major universities. The night before the science fair, I could barely sleep. My project filled an entire display board, complete with microscopic soil samples, chemical analysis charts, a scale model of a proposed Mars habitat, and a detailed explanation of how future colonists might extract water and oxygen from the Martian environment. I had practiced my presentation dozens of times, anticipating every possible question, preparing for the kind of rigorous inquiry that would prove I understood not just the surface details, but the underlying science that made it all possible. Dad had promised to attend the science fair, something that meant the world to me. While he often expressed puzzled affection for my scientific interests, he'd never really engaged with them seriously. This felt like my chance to show him that my passion wasn't just a phase or a hobby, but something substantial and worthy of respect. I imagined his face lighting up with pride as I explained the complexities of atmospheric composition and terraforming possibilities, finally bridging the gap between his practical worldview and my seemingly impossible dreams. The Millbrook Community Center buzzed with activity that Saturday morning, as students, parents, and judges moved between displays of volcano models, plant growth experiments, and solar system dioramas. My project stood out immediately, both for its sophistication and for its sheer ambition. While most presentations focused on basic scientific principles or simple demonstrations, mine tackled questions that professional scientists were actively researching. Complete with references to current NASA missions and peer-reviewed papers I'd tracked down through Dr. Rodriguez's university connections. The judges were impressed. Dr. Sarah Chen from the regional university spent 20 minutes at my display, asking increasingly technical questions that I answered with growing confidence. The local pediatrician who volunteered as a judge told my parents that my research methodology was graduate-level work. Even the high school principal, who usually rushed through science fair duties, lingered to understand my theories about in-situ resource utilization on Mars. But it was Dad's reaction that I was waiting for. The validation that would finally prove that my dreams weren't just adolescent fantasy, but legitimate ambition backed by real knowledge and skill. When he finally approached my display, I launched into my presentation with nervous energy, explaining how Martian soil contained the raw materials necessary for creating breathable air, drinkable water, and even construction materials for future human settlements. I showed him the spectroscopic analysis charts, demonstrated how chemical processes could extract precious resources from seemingly barren dirt, and painted a picture of human civilization expanding beyond Earth within our lifetimes. My voice carried the passion of someone who had found their purpose, and I could see other parents and students gathering around the edges of my display, drawn by the enthusiasm and depth of my presentation. When I finished, breathless and expectant, Dad studied my display board for a long moment. I waited for the pride, the amazement, the recognition that his daughter had accomplished something remarkable. Instead, he sighed and placed a gentle but patronizing hand on my shoulder. His voice carried the tone of patient correction that I'd heard him use with struggling students. Kind but firmly dismissive. "Sarah, honey," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "you're not smart enough for this kind of thing. Maybe you should focus on something more realistic." The words hit me like a physical blow. The crowd around my display began to disperse, their interest apparently validated by Dad's assessment. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been watching from across the room, looked stricken. The judges who had been so impressed suddenly seemed to see my project differently, as if Dad's opinion carried more weight than their own expertise. I felt my face burn with humiliation as Dad continued, his voice taking on the instructional tone he used in his classroom. "I know you've worked hard on this, and it shows real creativity, but space exploration is for people with exceptional abilities. People who went to elite schools and have advantages we just don't have here in Millbrook. There's nothing wrong with being smart enough for teaching or nursing or any number of good careers that don't require quite so much of what you'd need for something like NASA." The worst part wasn't the public humiliation, though that stung deeply. The worst part was seeing the doubt creep into the faces of people who had been impressed moments before. If my own father, a teacher, didn't believe I had the intellectual capacity for advanced scientific work, who were they to disagree? The judges moved on to other displays. The crowd dispersed. Even my carefully constructed confidence began to crumble under the weight of such definitive dismissal from the person whose opinion mattered most. I won second place that day, which under normal circumstances would have been cause for celebration. Dr. Rodriguez presented me with the ribbon and certificate with tears in her eyes, whispering that my project was the most sophisticated she'd ever seen from a high school student. But the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the knowledge that the person whose approval I craved most had labeled my greatest achievement as evidence of my limitations rather than my potential. The ride home was silent, the red ribbon lying forgotten in my lap as I stared out the window at the familiar landscape of cornfields and farmhouses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad tried to fill the silence with gentle encouragement about other career paths, suggestions about education majors or nursing programs that would be perfect for someone with my interests in helping people. Mom murmured supportive comments about how proud she was of my hard work, but I could hear the underlying agreement with Dad's assessment in her tone. That night, alone in my room, surrounded by astronomy posters and science textbooks, I made a decision that would define the next 13 years of my life. I wouldn't argue with Dad's assessment. I wouldn't try to convince him or anyone else in Millbrook that they were wrong about my capabilities. Instead, I would prove it through actions, through achievements so undeniable that no one could question whether I was smart enough, capable enough, or ambitious enough to reach for the stars. Dr. Rodriguez found me the Monday after the science fair, staying late in the physics lab, as I often did. She sat down beside me at the lab bench, where I was half-heartedly working through practice problems. Her presence warm and understanding in the fluorescent-lit room that had become my sanctuary. "Your father means well," she said quietly, her accent carrying the weight of someone who had faced her own share of doubts and dismissals. "But he's wrong about your abilities, Sarah. I've taught physics for 15 years, at universities and high schools, and I've never seen a student with your combination of intuitive understanding and rigorous methodology. You don't just memorize formulas. You grasp the underlying principles and apply them in ways that show real scientific thinking." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your Mars project wasn't just impressive for a high school student. It was impressive, period. The analysis you did of spectroscopic data, the way you connected atmospheric chemistry to potential life support systems, the thoroughness of your research methodology, all of that represents the kind of thinking that drives real scientific breakthroughs." Dr. Rodriguez reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder filled with university applications, scholarship information, and program descriptions for aerospace engineering degrees. "I've been putting this together for weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it with you. There are programs specifically designed for students like you. students who have the passion and ability to push the boundaries of what we know about space exploration. As I flipped through the materials, my heart began to race with possibility. Universities I'd only heard about in whispered conversations about impossible dreams suddenly seemed tangible, achievable with the right preparation and dedication. Scholarship programs for women in STEM fields offered pathways to education that wouldn't burden my family financially. Research opportunities at NASA and private aerospace companies promised the chance to work on the very questions that had captivated me since childhood. But what if Dad's right? I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me since Saturday. What if I'm not actually smart enough for this level of work? What if I'm just fooling myself? Dr. Rodriguez smiled with the confidence of someone who had seen enough students to recognize true potential. Intelligence isn't just about raw ability, Sarah. It's about curiosity, persistence, the willingness to tackle complex problems and learn from failure. You have all of those qualities in abundance, plus something rarer, the ability to see connections between different areas of knowledge and apply them in innovative ways. She stood up, gathering her materials but leaving the folder with me. Your father's opinion comes from love and concern, but it also comes from limited experience with the kind of work you're capable of doing. He's never seen someone from Millbrook pursue aerospace engineering, so he assumes it's impossible. But impossibility is just another problem to solve, and you've already shown you know how to solve complex problems. That conversation marked the beginning of my secret campaign to prove that small-town girl could reach the stars. I spent the rest of my junior year and all of my senior year working with Dr. Rodriguez to prepare for university applications, taking online courses that challenged me beyond anything Millbrook High could offer, and building a portfolio of scientific work that would demonstrate my readiness for advanced study. I applied to Ohio State University's aerospace engineering program, along with several backup options that would still allow me to pursue my interests while staying within a reasonable distance of home. When the acceptance letter arrived, along with a partial scholarship based on my academic performance and my science fair recognition, I felt the first crack in the wall of doubt that had surrounded me since that devastating Saturday at the community center. Dad's reaction to my college acceptance was complicated, a mixture of pride and concern that perfectly encapsulated his approach to my ambitions. He was genuinely happy that I'd earned recognition for my academic work, but he couldn't hide his worry about my chosen field of study. During family dinner the night after my acceptance letter arrived, he expressed his concerns with the same gentle authority he'd used at the science fair. "I'm proud of you for getting into Ohio State, Sarah. I really am," he said, cutting his meatloaf into precise squares as he spoke. "But I worry about setting your sights on something so competitive and uncertain. Aerospace engineering is incredibly difficult, and even if you graduate, the job market is limited. Maybe you could consider teaching high school physics instead? You could still use your science background, but in a more stable, practical way." Michael nodded agreement from across the table, his practical engineering perspective aligning with Dad's concerns. "Sarah's definitely smart," he said, his tone suggesting this was a generous assessment. "But space stuff is really specialized. Companies like Boeing or NASA, they're looking for people from MIT or Stanford, people who've been groomed for this kind of work their whole lives. Maybe she should think about mechanical engineering instead, something with broader applications." Jennifer, always the diplomatic middle ground, suggested that I could minor in marketing or business to give myself backup options. "That way, if the space thing doesn't work out, you'd still have practical skills to fall back on," she said, her suggestion carrying the implicit assumption that falling back was inevitable rather than merely possible. Mom, as always, tried to balance support for my dreams with loyalty to Dad's perspective. "We just want what's best for you, honey," she said, her voice carrying the weight of parental concern. "College is expensive, and if you're going to invest that much time and money, we want to make sure it leads somewhere stable and secure." I listened to their concerns with outward patience while inwardly committing even more deeply to my chosen path. Their love was genuine, but their vision was limited by their own experiences and expectations. They couldn't imagine someone from our family, from our town, from our background, succeeding in a field they associated with privilege and exceptional ability. Their doubt wasn't malicious, It was protective, an attempt to shield me from the disappointment they believed was inevitable when small-town dreams collided with big-world realities. But I had Dr. Rodriguez's confidence echoing in my memory, and I had my own growing understanding of what I was capable of achieving. The girl who had researched Martian soil composition at 16 was ready to prove that intelligence, determination, and hard work could overcome any limitation that geography or background might impose. The folder Dr. Rodriguez had given me became my roadmap to a future that no one in my family could envision, but that I was determined to create through sheer force of will and relentless preparation. As I packed for college that fall, loading my few possessions into the back of Dad's pickup truck for the drive to Columbus, I carried with me not just clothes and textbooks, but the burning need to prove that the girl they saw as not smart enough could reach heights they couldn't even imagine. The stars that had called to me from Millbrook's dark skies were waiting, and I was finally ready to begin the journey toward them. Ohio State University's campus stretched before me like a concrete and brick promise of transformation, its towering buildings and bustling walkways representing everything that Millbrook wasn't. The aerospace engineering department occupied a modern complex on the north side of campus, where wind tunnels hummed behind thick walls and laboratories buzzed with the energy of students building rockets, testing materials, and pushing the boundaries of what humans could achieve in the realm of flight and space exploration. My freshman year was a baptism by fire that tested every assumption I'd held about my own capabilities. The coursework was relentless, demanding mastery of advanced mathematics, physics principles that stretched far beyond what Dr. Rodriguez had been able to teach me, and engineering concepts that required a complete rewiring of how I approached problem solving. While my high school classmates were settling into comfortable routines at regional colleges, I was struggling through calculus-based physics at 7 in the morning, followed by materials, science, thermodynamics, and engineering design courses that consumed every waking hour. The other students in my program seemed to possess an effortless confidence that I envied and feared in equal measure. Many came from families where engineering was a tradition, where dinner table conversations had included discussions of stress analysis and aerodynamic principles since childhood. They referenced internships at major corporations, family connections at aerospace companies, and summer programs at prestigious institutions that had been preparing them for exactly this kind of academic challenge since middle school. My roommate, Amanda Chen, was a perfect example of the kind of student I felt destined to compete against. Her father worked as a senior engineer at Boeing, her mother held a PhD in materials science, and Amanda herself had attended a specialized STEM high school in Seattle, where students built functioning satellites as senior projects. She spoke casually about visiting NASA facilities during family vacations, attending aerospace conferences as a teenager, and growing up with the assumption that she would naturally excel in whatever technical field captured her interest. Amanda wasn't unkind about our different backgrounds, but the casual way she referenced experiences and opportunities that seemed impossibly exotic to me highlighted just how much ground I had to make up. When she mentioned summer internships at companies I'd only read about online, or talked about research opportunities her father's colleagues had suggested, I felt the familiar sting of being an outsider looking into a world where I didn't naturally belong. The academic work itself proved both more challenging and more exhilarating than anything I'd experienced in Millbrook. Professor James Chen, who taught our introductory aerospace engineering course, had worked at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center before transitioning to academia, and his lectures brought real-world space exploration challenges directly into our classroom. He didn't just teach us the mathematics of orbital mechanics. He shared stories about missions he'd contributed to, problems that had required innovative solutions, and the kind of creative thinking that separated competent engineers from those who pushed the field forward. During one particularly memorable lecture about the challenges of Mars exploration, Professor Chen displayed photographs from the Curiosity rover mission, images of Martian terrain that made my heart race with recognition and possibility. As he explained the engineering challenges involved in landing a car-sized rover on another planet, using atmospheric entry, descent, and landing systems that had to work perfectly on the first try, I felt that same electric excitement I'd experienced while working on my high school science fair project. After class, I approached Professor Chen with questions that went far beyond the assigned coursework. I wanted to understand not just how the landing systems worked, but how engineers had developed innovative solutions to problems that had never been solved before. How did they test systems for an environment they couldn't fully replicate on Earth? How did they balance the competing demands of weight restrictions, reliability requirements, and scientific objectives? Professor Chen listened to my questions with the kind of focused attention that told me he was genuinely evaluating my thinking process rather than simply being polite to an eager student. His responses were detailed and technical, and when I asked follow-up questions that demonstrated I'd grasped the underlying principles, I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the kind of professional interest that suggested he saw potential worth cultivating. "Have you given any thought to specializing in planetary exploration systems?" he asked as other students filed out of the lecture hall around us. "Your questions suggest you're thinking about these challenges in ways that could contribute to real mission planning." The suggestion felt both thrilling and impossible. Specializing in planetary exploration would mean focusing my entire academic career on the most competitive and specialized area of aerospace engineering, the field where only the most exceptional students had any hope of contributing meaningful work. It was exactly the kind of ambitious goal that Dad would describe as unrealistic, the kind of dream that practical people in Millbrook would gently discourage in favor of safer alternatives. But Professor Chen's suggestion carried weight, because it came from someone who understood both the challenges and the possibilities of the field. Unlike the well-meaning discouragement I'd received at home, his words reflected professional assessment based on demonstrated capability rather than assumptions about background or limitations. I spent that evening in the library researching everything I could find about current Mars exploration programs, upcoming mission plans, and the kinds of engineering challenges that would need solutions in the coming decades. The more I read, the more I understood that this field was evolving rapidly, with private companies joining government agencies in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The barriers to entry were high, but they were intellectual and technical barriers rather than social or economic ones. Success would depend on knowledge, creativity, and determination rather than family connections or inherited advantages. My phone calls home during those first months of college followed a predictable pattern that highlighted the growing distance between my daily reality and my family's understanding of what I was experiencing. Dad would ask about my grades with the kind of concerned attention that suggested he was monitoring for signs that the workload was too demanding. When I mentioned specific courses or projects, his responses carried a mixture of pride and bewilderment that made clear he couldn't fully grasp what I was studying or why it mattered. "How's that rocket science class going?" he would ask, using the phrase with slight irony that suggested he still found my academic focus somewhat amusing. When I tried to explain the complexities of spacecraft design or the mathematics of orbital transfers, I could hear him losing interest, waiting for the conversation to move to more familiar territory like my dormitory situation, or whether I was eating properly. Michael's responses were more directly challenging, his practical engineering background giving him just enough knowledge to question my choices, while missing the broader picture of what aerospace work actually involved. "All that theoretical stuff is interesting," he would say, "but at the end of the day, companies need engineers who can solve real problems with real constraints. Space stuff is pretty niche, and the job market is limited. You might want to keep your options open." Jennifer approached my studies with the kind of supportive confusion that characterized her approach to anything she didn't fully understand. "It sounds really challenging and impressive," she would say, her tone suggesting that impressive and practical were mutually exclusive categories. "Just make sure you're not making things too hard for yourself. There are probably easier ways to use your science background." Mom's responses carried the most emotional weight because they reflected genuine love combined with genuine worry. "We're so proud of how hard you're working, honey," she would say, "but we want to make sure you're not pushing yourself beyond what's healthy. If you ever decide you want to come home and attend the community college here, there's no shame in that. Sometimes the best opportunities are closer to home than we think." These conversations left me feeling increasingly isolated, not because my family didn't love me, but because they couldn't understand the world I was entering or support the ambitions that were beginning to define my identity. Their concern came from a place of genuine care, but it also came from a fundamental inability to envision someone from our background succeeding in the field I'd chosen. They were protecting me from disappointment by encouraging me to lower my expectations, but their protection felt like limitation rather than love. The contrast between my family's reactions and Professor Chen's growing interest in my academic development became more pronounced as my freshman year progressed. While my family worried that I was attempting something beyond my capabilities, Professor Chen began including me in discussions that went far beyond the standard curriculum. He shared research papers from current Mars mission planning, invited me to attend guest lectures by visiting scientists, and began treating me as someone whose insights might contribute to real engineering challenges, rather than simply someone learning established principles. During the spring semester, Professor Chen approached me about participating in a research project that would extend through the summer months. The project involved developing computational models for atmospheric entry systems, the kind of technical work that would give me hands-on experience with the mathematical and engineering principles that govern spacecraft design for planetary missions. This would be paid research, he explained, and the work would contribute to papers we're planning to submit for publication. It's the kind of experience that graduate schools and employers look for when they're evaluating candidates for advanced positions. The opportunity felt like a doorway opening to exactly the kind of future I'd been dreaming about since high school, but it also meant staying on campus through the summer, instead of returning home to work at the local grocery store or restaurant where most Millbrook college students earn money during break periods. It meant missing family gatherings, summer traditions, and the expectation that I would spend vacation time reconnecting with home rather than pursuing academic work. When I called to explain the research opportunity to my parents, their response reflected the same mixture of pride and concern that had characterized their reaction to my college acceptance. Dad was genuinely impressed that a professor had selected me for paid research work, but he worried about the practical implications of staying away from home for an extended period. "That sounds like a real honor, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying genuine pleasure at my academic recognition. "But are you sure it's worth missing the whole summer at home? You could probably find good work here that would pay just as well, and you'd be able to spend time with family and friends. College is important, but so is maintaining connections to where you come from." Mom's concerns focused on the isolation and intensity of spending summer months, focused entirely on academic work. "You've been working so hard all year," she said, "and maybe you need a break from all that pressure. Sometimes the best thing for learning is taking time away from it, giving your mind a chance to rest and recharge." Their perspectives weren't wrong, but they reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how competitive academic and professional development worked in fields like aerospace engineering. Taking summers off might be appropriate for students who were simply completing degree requirements, but students who hoped to compete for the most selective graduate programs and career opportunities needed to demonstrate sustained commitment and progressive skill development. The research experience Professor Chen was offering wasn't just a job. It was an investment in the kind of expertise that would distinguish me from other candidates throughout my career. I tried to explain this to my family, but I could hear the doubt in their responses. They understood hard work and dedication, but they couldn't grasp the specific demands of building a career in highly specialized technical fields. Their version of success involved completing education efficiently and transitioning to stable employment as quickly as possible, while my emerging understanding of aerospace engineering suggested that real opportunities required years of sustained excellence and continuous learning. The summer research project exceeded every expectation I'd had about what undergraduate academic work could involve. Professor Chen assigned me to work with a team of graduate students who were developing computational fluid dynamics models for spacecraft atmospheric entry, technical work that required mastery of advanced mathematics, programming skills, and engineering principles that pushed far beyond anything I'd encountered in my coursework. Dr. Amy Foster, a postdoctoral researcher who had completed her PhD at MIT, became my direct supervisor for the project. Dr. Foster had worked on actual NASA missions, contributing to engineering teams that had successfully landed multiple rovers on Mars, and her approach to research combined theoretical rigor with practical application in ways that showed me what real aerospace engineering looked like. Under Foster's guidance, I learned to use professional-grade software for modeling atmospheric dynamics, developed programming skills that allowed me to create and test complex simulations, and began to understand how theoretical knowledge translated into practical engineering solutions. The work was demanding in ways that my regular coursework hadn't prepared me for, requiring 12-hour days in the lab and constant learning of new techniques and concepts. But the intellectual satisfaction of contributing to work that could potentially influence real mission design was unlike anything I'd experienced. When our models successfully predicted atmospheric behavior that matched data from previous Mars missions, I felt the same electric excitement I'd experienced during my high school science fair project, but amplified by the knowledge that this work was contributing to humanity's expanding presence in the solar system. Dr. Foster's mentorship style was completely different from what I'd experienced with any previous teacher or professor. Rather than explaining concepts and expecting me to absorb them, she assigned me problems that forced me to discover solutions through research, experimentation, and creative thinking. When I struggled with particularly challenging aspects of the modeling work, she wouldn't provide answers directly, but would point me toward resources and suggest approaches that would help me develop my own understanding. The difference between a good engineer and an exceptional one, she told me during one of our weekly progress meetings, isn't the ability to apply known solutions to familiar problems. It's the ability to recognize when existing approaches aren't sufficient and develop new methods for tackling challenges that haven't been solved before. This philosophy resonated with everything I'd felt during my high school research, but hadn't been able to articulate. The excitement I'd experienced while investigating Martian soil composition hadn't come from learning established facts, but from making connections between different areas of knowledge and applying them in ways that generated new insights. Dr. Foster was describing the kind of thinking that had driven my science fair project, but elevating it to the level of professional scientific work. As the summer progressed, my contributions to the research project evolved from basic computational tasks to genuine problem-solving that required independent thinking and creative application of engineering principles. When our initial atmospheric models failed to account for certain variables in Martian atmospheric density, Dr. Foster challenged me to research potential explanations and propose modifications to our computational approach. The solution I developed, incorporating seasonal atmospheric variations that previous models had treated as static conditions, not only improved our simulation accuracy, but contributed new insights that Dr. Foster believed were worth including in the research paper we were preparing for publication. Seeing my name listed as a co-author on a paper that would be submitted to a peer-reviewed aerospace engineering journal felt like concrete validation that my work was contributing genuine value to the field. When I called home to share the news about the publication opportunity, the response reflected the same pattern of proud bewilderment that had characterized my family's reaction to most of my college achievements. Dad was genuinely pleased that my summer work had been successful enough to result in publication, but he didn't fully grasp what academic publication meant, or why it was significant for my future career prospects. "That's wonderful, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying real warmth and pride. "Your professor must think very highly of your work to include your name on something like that. Just make sure you're keeping things in perspective and not getting too caught up in the academic side of things. Real engineering work is probably pretty different from research projects." Michael's response was more directly skeptical, reflecting his practical engineering background and his assumptions about what kind of work actually mattered in professional settings. "Publishing papers is nice for professors," he said, "but companies care more about practical experience and demonstrated results. All that theoretical research is interesting, but it doesn't necessarily translate to being able to solve real engineering problems in industry." Their reactions stung because they revealed how little my family understood about the field I was entering and the level of achievement I was beginning to reach. Academic publication wasn't separate from practical engineering work. In aerospace, it was often the foundation for the innovations that drove real mission design and technological advancement. The computational modeling skills I was developing weren't abstract academic exercises. They were the tools that professional engineers used to design spacecraft systems that had to work perfectly in environments where failure meant mission loss and potentially crew safety. But their lack of understanding also strengthened my resolve to continue pursuing the path that felt authentic to my interests and abilities, regardless of whether my family could appreciate the significance of what I was achieving. Dr. Foster's mentorship had shown me what was possible when intellectual curiosity was combined with rigorous technical training and real research experience. Professor Chen's confidence in my abilities had opened doors to opportunities that my background shouldn't have made possible. As my sophomore year began, I carried with me not just the technical skills and knowledge I'd gained during the summer research project, but a growing understanding of my own capabilities and the kind of career I wanted to build. The girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science was discovering that she not only belonged in aerospace engineering, but had the potential to contribute original work that could influence how humans explored other worlds. The research experience had also clarified something important about my relationship with my family's expectations and concerns. Their love and worry were genuine, but their vision of appropriate ambition was constrained by their own experiences and their assumptions about what someone from our background could reasonably achieve. I could honor their care while pursuing goals that stretched beyond their comfort zone, but doing so would require me to find validation and support from mentors and colleagues who understood the field I was entering. Dr. Foster had become the kind of mentor that Dr. Rodriguez had been in high school, someone who saw potential that wasn't immediately obvious, and was willing to invest time and energy in helping me develop that potential. Under her continued guidance, I began to understand that the path from small-town Ohio to NASA wasn't just possible but achievable through sustained excellence, strategic choices, and the kind of intellectual courage that refused to be limited by other people's assumptions about what was realistic or appropriate. The foundation was being laid for achievements that would eventually prove, beyond any doubt, that the girl from Millbrook was not just smart enough for space science but destined to contribute to humanity's greatest adventure. My junior year brought opportunities that seemed to arrive faster than I could process them, each one representing a choice between the familiar safety of conventional expectations and the uncertain terrain of pushing boundaries that no one in my family had ever approached. The research paper Dr. Foster and I had submitted was accepted for publication in the Journal of Spacecraft and Rockets, a development that transformed my academic standing from promising undergraduate to someone whose work was contributing genuine value to ongoing aerospace research. The publication opened doors I hadn't known existed. Graduate schools that had seemed impossibly selective began reaching out with recruitment materials. Professor Chen started including me in faculty meetings where upcoming research projects were discussed, treating my input as valuable rather than educational. Most significantly, Dr. Foster recommended me for a competitive summer internship at NASA's Ames Research Center in California, an opportunity that would place me directly within the ecosystem where future Mars missions were being planned and developed. The NASA internship application process was unlike anything I'd experienced, requiring not just academic transcripts and recommendation letters, but detailed technical writing samples, engineering problem-solving assessments, and interviews with senior researchers who evaluated candidates based on their potential to contribute meaningful work to active mission development. The competition was intense, drawing applicants from universities across the country, many of whom had advantages I could barely imagine. During the interview process, conducted via video conference with a panel of NASA engineers and scientists, I found myself explaining my atmospheric modeling research to people who had designed and operated spacecraft that were currently exploring Mars. The technical questions they asked pushed far beyond textbook knowledge, requiring me to demonstrate how I approached unfamiliar problems and adapted established principles to novel situations. One particularly challenging question involved optimizing landing system performance for varying atmospheric conditions on Mars, a scenario that required me to integrate atmospheric physics, materials, science, and engineering design principles in real time. As I worked through the problem aloud, explaining my reasoning and acknowledging the limitations of my proposed solutions, I could see the interviewer's expressions shift from polite assessment to genuine interest. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the lead engineer for atmospheric entry systems at Ames, asked follow-up questions that revealed she was evaluating not just my technical knowledge but my thinking process and my ability to communicate complex ideas clearly. When the interview concluded, she mentioned that they were particularly interested in candidates who could contribute fresh perspectives to challenges that established researchers had been working on for years. 3 weeks later, the acceptance email arrived with details about a summer position working directly on atmospheric modeling for the Mars Sample Return mission, humanity's most ambitious planetary exploration project to date. The internship would involve developing computational tools for optimizing sample collection strategies, work that would directly influence mission planning for spacecraft scheduled to launch within the next decade. My phone call home to share the NASA internship news produced reactions that perfectly encapsulated the growing disconnect between my achievements and my family's ability to process what those achievements meant. Dad's initial response was pure pride mixed with disbelief, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the daughter he knew with someone who had been selected for work at NASA. "They're actually going to pay you to work on rocket science?" he asked, his voice carrying wonder and concern in equal measure. "That sounds incredible, Sarah, but are you sure you're ready for that level of responsibility? These are real missions with billions of dollars at stake." Michael's reaction was more complex, reflecting his engineering background and his assumptions about how technical careers typically developed. "NASA internships are impressive," he acknowledged, "but don't get too caught up in the prestige factor. Most of those positions don't lead to permanent jobs, and the work is probably pretty specialized. You'll want to make sure you're developing skills that transfer to other industries if the space thing doesn't work out." Jennifer approached the news with enthusiastic support that revealed she understood the significance, even if she couldn't grasp the technical details. "This is amazing, Sarah. You'll probably meet all kinds of interesting people and have stories that will impress everyone for the rest of your life. Just make sure you take lots of pictures and document everything so you can remember it all." Mom's response carried the emotional weight of a parent watching her child venture into territory that felt both wonderful and frightening. "We're so proud of you, honey," she said, her voice thick with tears. "When you were little and spent all those hours looking at the stars, I never imagined it would lead to something like this. Just promise me you'll be careful and remember that you always have a home here if things get overwhelming." Their reactions were loving and supportive, but they also revealed how completely my trajectory had diverged from anything they could have anticipated or prepared for. In their minds, I was still the girl from Millbrook who had shown unusual interest in science, not someone whose work was beginning to contribute to humanity's exploration of other worlds. The gap between their perception and my reality was widening, not through any failure of love on either side, but through the simple fact that my path was leading into territory they had no experience navigating. The summer at NASA Ames Research Center felt like stepping into a science fiction novel that had somehow become reality. The facility sprawled across acres of California landscape, housing wind tunnels capable of simulating atmospheric conditions throughout the solar system, laboratories where materials were tested under the extreme conditions of space travel, and computing centers where the mathematical models that guided spacecraft design were refined and validated. My supervisor, Dr. Marcus Webb, had spent 15 years working on Mars exploration missions, contributing to the engineering teams that had successfully landed rovers, deployed orbital reconnaissance systems, and planned the increasingly sophisticated missions that would culminate in human exploration of the Red Planet. His approach to mentorship was demanding but supportive, assigning me projects that stretched my capabilities while providing the guidance necessary to prevent me from becoming overwhelmed by the complexity of real mission development. The work itself exceeded every expectation I'd formed about what NASA internship experience would involve. Rather than being assigned routine computational tasks or data analysis, I was given responsibility for developing simulation models that would help mission planners optimize sample collection strategies for the Mars Sample Return Project. The software I was creating would influence decisions about where spacecraft would land, how robotic systems would navigate Martian terrain, and which geological samples would be selected for return to Earth. Working alongside experienced mission engineers, I began to understand the intricate balance of competing constraints that governed every aspect of spacecraft design. Mission success required not just technical excellence, but creative problem-solving that could adapt to unforeseen challenges, optimize performance within severe weight and power limitations, and maintain reliability in environments where repair or replacement was impossible. Dr. Webb's approach to technical problem-solving was revelatory, combining rigorous mathematical analysis with intuitive understanding of how complex systems behaved under real-world conditions. When our initial simulation models failed to account for unexpected variations in Martian atmospheric density, he guided me through a systematic investigation that identified not just the source of the discrepancy but potential solutions that could improve mission performance beyond the original specifications. Engineering isn't just about applying known solutions to familiar problems, he explained during one of our weekly progress reviews. The most important breakthroughs come from recognizing when established approaches aren't sufficient and developing new methods that expand what's possible. Your atmospheric modeling work is contributing insights that could influence how we approach sample collection for the next decade of Mars exploration. The validation of contributing meaningful work to actual mission development was intoxicating, but it also carried weight that I hadn't anticipated. Every line of code I wrote, every simulation I ran, every analysis I completed, was part of a process that would ultimately influence decisions about spacecraft that would travel hundreds of millions of miles to collect samples that could answer fundamental questions about the possibility of life beyond Earth. My colleagues at Ames came from universities and backgrounds that spanned the globe, but they shared a common commitment to pushing the boundaries of what humans could achieve in space exploration. Working alongside people who had devoted their careers to answering questions about planetary formation, atmospheric evolution, and the potential for life on other worlds, provided perspective on just how significant the work was that I was beginning to contribute to. Dr. Sarah Kim, a planetary geologist who had spent years analyzing data from previous Mars missions, became an unofficial mentor whose expertise complemented the engineering focus of my primary assignment. She helped me understand how the technical systems I was modeling would be used by scientists to select samples that could provide insights into billions of years of Martian geological history. The samples we bring back from Mars won't just tell us about the red planet, she explained as we reviewed simulation results that would influence landing site selection. They'll help us understand how planetary systems form and evolve, providing context for Earth's own geological history and potentially revealing whether the conditions that allowed life to develop here might have existed elsewhere. This broader perspective on the significance of Mars exploration transformed my understanding of what I was working toward. The technical challenges that had initially captured my interest in atmospheric modeling and spacecraft design were part of a larger human endeavor to expand our presence in the solar system and answer fundamental questions about our place in the universe. During my third week at Ames, Dr. Webb invited me to attend a mission planning meeting where senior engineers and scientists were discussing upcoming objectives for the Mars Sample Return Project. The conference room was filled with people whose names I recognized from research papers I'd studied. Individuals who had designed and operated the most sophisticated robotic explorers ever deployed on another planet. As I listened to discussions about landing system modifications, sample caching strategies, and orbital rendezvous procedures, I realized that the work I was contributing wasn't peripheral to mission development, but integral to decisions that would shape how humanity explored Mars for the coming decade. The simulation models I was refining would influence where spacecraft would land, how they would navigate the Martian surface, and which geological samples would be selected for return to Earth. When Dr. Webb asked me to present preliminary results from my atmospheric modeling work, addressing a room full of senior mission engineers felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The technical questions they asked pushed my understanding to its limits, but their engagement with my analysis revealed that they valued the fresh perspective I was bringing to challenges they'd been working on for years. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission systems engineer responsible for integrating all aspects of spacecraft design, asked particularly detailed questions about how atmospheric variations might affect sample collection timelines. As I explained the implications of my modeling results for mission planning, I could see her taking notes that would influence actual operational decisions for spacecraft currently under development. Your analysis suggests we might need to reconsider our assumptions about optimal landing windows, she said after I'd completed my presentation. The atmospheric modeling you've developed could significantly improve our ability to predict conditions during critical mission phases. The meeting concluded with Dr. Webb assigning me additional responsibilities that would expand my modeling work to encompass broader aspects of atmospheric entry and descent systems. The trust he was placing in my abilities felt both validating and overwhelming, representing confidence in my technical capabilities that surpassed anything I'd experienced in academic settings. That evening, calling home to share highlights from the mission planning meeting, I encountered the familiar challenge of translating experiences that felt monumental to me into terms my family could understand and appreciate. Dad's questions focused on practical concerns about whether the internship was leading toward permanent employment opportunities, while Mom worried about whether the pressure and responsibility were becoming too intense for someone my age. "It sounds like they're giving you important work," Dad said, his voice carrying pride mixed with concern. Just make sure you're not taking on more than you can handle. These NASA people have been doing this for years, and you don't want to promise more than you can deliver. Michael's perspective reflected his engineering background and his assumptions about how career development typically progressed. Internships are great for learning, he said, but don't get too invested in any particular project or company. The aerospace industry is cyclical, and you want to develop skills that will be valuable in multiple settings if funding priorities change. Their advice was well-intentioned and reflected genuine concern for my well-being, but it also revealed how completely they misunderstood the trajectory my career was following. The work I was doing at NASA wasn't just an educational experience or a resume builder. It was the foundation for contributions to human space exploration that could define my professional identity for decades to come. Dr. Foster, who had recommended me for the NASA internship, visited Ames during my final week to check on my progress and discuss plans for continuing our collaboration during my senior year. Her assessment of my development over the summer provided perspective that my family's concerns couldn't offer. Evaluation from someone who understood both the technical demands of aerospace engineering and the competitive landscape for career advancement in the field. Your progress this summer has been exceptional, she told me as we reviewed the final reports I'd prepared on my atmospheric modeling work. The simulation tools you've developed are sophisticated enough to contribute to actual mission planning, and your ability to communicate complex technical concepts clearly makes you exactly the kind of engineer that NASA and other aerospace organizations are looking for. She paused, choosing her words carefully before continuing. I think it's time to start considering graduate school applications seriously. Your undergraduate research and this NASA internship have established credentials that would make you competitive for the most selective programs in the country. The question isn't whether you're capable of succeeding at that level, but whether you're ready to commit to the kind of intensive focus that doctoral-level research requires. The suggestion of pursuing graduate school felt like both a natural next step and a radical departure from anything my family had envisioned for my education. In Millbrook, college graduation was the ultimate educational achievement, the credential that opened doors to stable middle-class careers and comfortable suburban lives. The idea of extending formal education for additional years to pursue specialized research felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Dr. Foster's recommendation carried weight because it reflected professional assessment rather than familial expectation or small-town assumptions about appropriate ambition. She understood the aerospace industry's requirements for technical expertise and the level of specialization necessary to contribute meaningful work to cutting-edge mission development. Her confidence in my abilities was based on demonstrated performance rather than hopeful projection. As my summer at NASA concluded, I carried with me not just technical knowledge and research experience, but a transformed understanding of what my career could become. The girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science had spent 3 months contributing to mission planning for humanity's most ambitious exploration of another world. The simulation models I had developed would influence real decisions about spacecraft design and operational strategies for missions that would expand human presence in the solar system. The transition back to Ohio State for my senior year felt like returning to a familiar place that no longer quite fit the person I was becoming. My professors treated me differently, acknowledging the significance of my NASA experience and the level of expertise I had developed through working on active mission development. Fellow students sought my perspective on career planning and graduate school applications, recognizing that my summer work had provided insights into professional opportunities that few undergraduates could access. But the most significant change was internal, a quiet confidence that came from having proven my capabilities in the most demanding professional environment I could imagine. The doubts that had plagued me since that devastating science fair comment had been replaced by the knowledge that I not only belonged in aerospace engineering, but had the potential to contribute work that could influence humanity's exploration of other worlds. The foundation was now in place for the next phase of my journey, graduate studies that would deepen my expertise and position me for the kind of career opportunities that had seemed impossible when I first arrived at Ohio State. The girl from Millbrook was ready to reach for goals that even her most supportive mentors were only beginning to recognize as achievable. Graduate school at Stanford represented a level of academic intensity that made my undergraduate experience seem like gentle preparation for the real work of pushing scientific boundaries. The aerospace engineering doctoral program attracted students from around the world, each one representing the pinnacle of achievement from their respective institutions. My cohort included a former fighter pilot who had transitioned to spacecraft design, a materials scientist who had developed new composites for extreme temperature applications, and a computer modeling expert who had created simulation software used by major aerospace contractors. The research I was conducting under Dr. Jennifer Martinez focused on atmospheric entry dynamics for large payload missions to Mars, technical work that would directly influence the engineering systems needed to land crewed spacecraft and heavy equipment on the Martian surface. The mathematical complexity of modeling atmospheric interactions for vehicles the size of future human habitats required computational approaches that were still being developed, making my dissertation research genuinely cutting-edge rather than simply an academic exercise. Dr. Martinez had worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory before joining Stanford's faculty, and her approach to research combined theoretical rigor with practical application that kept our work grounded in real mission requirements. She pushed me to consider not just whether our models were mathematically elegant, but whether they could contribute useful insights to engineers designing spacecraft that would carry humans to another planet within the next 2 decades. The pressure was relentless but exhilarating. My days began at 6 in the morning in the computational lab, running simulations that might take 12 hours to complete, analyzing results that often raised more questions than they answered, and refining models that needed to account for variables that had never been systematically studied. The work required mastery of advanced mathematics, programming languages, and engineering principles, but it also demanded the kind of creative problem-solving that couldn't be taught in any classroom. My family's understanding of what I was doing had become even more abstract as my work grew increasingly specialized. During our weekly phone calls, Dad would ask general questions about my studies that revealed he had no framework for understanding doctoral-level research in aerospace engineering. When I tried to explain the challenges of modeling hypersonic atmospheric entry, I could hear him losing interest, waiting for the conversation to shift to more familiar topics like my health, my living situation, or my plans for eventually returning to Ohio. "It sounds like you're really working hard," he would say, his tone carrying both pride and bewilderment. "Just make sure you're not getting so focused on all that theoretical stuff that you lose sight of practical career goals. At some point, you'll need to think about getting a real job and settling down." Michael's perspective had evolved somewhat as he'd gained more experience in his own engineering career, but he still viewed my academic focus with skepticism that reflected his assumptions about what kind of work provided genuine value. "All that research is impressive," he would acknowledge, "but companies care more about proven results than academic credentials. You might want to consider getting some industry experience before you get too deep into the university world." Jennifer's questions revealed that she was genuinely trying to understand what I was working toward, but her frame of reference remained limited to career paths that offered clear progression and visible markers of success. "When you finish your PhD, will you be Dr. Sarah?" she asked during one call. "That sounds really prestigious. Will you teach at colleges or do something else with all that education?" Mom's concerns focused increasingly on the personal costs of such intensive academic focus. "You've been in school for so long, honey," she would say, her voice carrying worry that felt both loving and limiting. "When do you get to start your real life? Marriage, family, a normal career where you don't have to work such long hours?" Their questions weren't unreasonable, but they reflected fundamental misunderstanding of how careers in cutting-edge scientific fields actually developed. The doctoral research I was conducting wasn't preparation for my career. It was the foundation of contributions to human space exploration that could define the next several decades of my professional life. The long hours and intense focus weren't obstacles to be endured, but investments in expertise that could help humanity expand its presence beyond Earth. During my 3rd year of graduate school, Dr. Martinez began including me in discussions about research proposals for NASA funding, technical work that would extend our atmospheric modeling studies to encompass the full range of mission architectures being considered for human Mars exploration. The proposal process required demonstrating not just technical competence but the ability to communicate complex engineering concepts to review panels composed of senior scientists and mission planners. Writing sections of the proposal felt like stepping into professional territory that I'd been preparing for since high school, but had never quite believed I would reach. The technical specifications we were proposing would influence real mission design decisions, and the funding we were requesting would support research that could contribute to landing systems for spacecraft carrying human crews to Mars. When the proposal was accepted for funding, Dr. Martinez assigned me primary responsibility for managing the computational aspects of the research, work that would involve coordinating with engineers at multiple NASA centers and aerospace contractors. The level of professional responsibility felt both thrilling and daunting, representing trust in my capabilities that exceeded anything I'd experienced during my academic career. The research progressed rapidly, producing results that exceeded our initial expectations and generating insights that attracted attention from mission planners working on actual Mars exploration programs. Our atmospheric modeling work was revealing previously unrecognized optimization opportunities for large payload entry systems, findings that could significantly improve the safety and efficiency of future crewed missions to Mars. 6 months into the funded research project, I received an email that would change the trajectory of my career in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Dr. Michael Chen, the mission systems engineer for NASA's Mars exploration program, was requesting a meeting to discuss potential collaboration between our Stanford research group and the teams developing entry, descent, and landing systems for crewed Mars missions. The video conference with Dr. Chen and his colleagues at Johnson Space Center felt like validation that the work I'd been pursuing since high school was finally reaching the level where it could contribute meaningful value to humanity's expansion into the solar system. They were interested not just in our research results but in my potential availability for consulting work that would bring our atmospheric modeling expertise directly into active mission development. Your computational models are addressing exactly the kinds of challenges we're facing as we scale up entry systems for crewed missions, Dr. Chen explained during our initial conversation. The atmospheric dynamics for large payloads are significantly more complex than anything we've dealt with for robotic missions, and your research is providing insights that could influence fundamental design decisions. The consulting opportunity would involve spending summers at Johnson Space Center, working directly with the engineering teams responsible for developing the entry, descent, and landing systems that would carry the first human crews to Mars. The work would be classified at the highest levels of mission security, requiring background investigations and security clearances that would grant access to the most closely guarded aspects of America's space exploration plans. When I called home to share news about the NASA consulting opportunity, my family's reaction reflected the same mixture of pride, concern, and bewilderment that had characterized their response to each milestone in my academic career. Dad was genuinely impressed that NASA was seeking my expertise, but he worried about the security requirements and the implications of becoming involved in classified government work. "It sounds like a tremendous honor," he said, his voice carrying both excitement and apprehension. "But are you sure you want to get involved in all that security clearance stuff? Once you're in that world, it might be hard to change directions if you decide you want to do something different." Michael's reaction was more directly positive, reflecting his engineering background and his understanding of how government contracting worked in technical fields. "NASA consulting is serious business," he acknowledged. "If they're bringing you in for classified work, they must think you're contributing something genuinely valuable. Just make sure you understand what you're committing to before you sign anything." Jennifer's questions focused on the prestige and excitement of working on space missions, aspects of the opportunity that she could appreciate, even without understanding the technical details. "You'll be working on rockets that go to Mars?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "That's like science fiction becoming real. You'll have to tell us everything you're allowed to share." Mom's response carried the emotional complexity of a parent watching her child venture into territory that felt both wonderful and frightening. "I'm so proud of how far you've come," she said, tears evident in her voice. "When you were little, I never imagined your interest in space would lead to something like this. Just promise me you'll be careful, and remember that we love you no matter what happens." Their reactions revealed how completely my trajectory had diverged from anything they could have anticipated. When I was the girl in Millbrook who spent hours staring at the stars through a garage sale telescope. The security clearance process alone represented entry into a world they had no experience navigating, a level of professional responsibility that placed me among the small group of individuals trusted with America's most sensitive space exploration plans. The background investigation required for my security clearance was exhaustive, involving interviews with neighbors from my childhood, professors from every educational institution I'd attended, and detailed review of my financial history, foreign contacts, and personal associations. The process took months to complete, during which I continued my dissertation research while anticipating the expanded access to classified mission planning that the clearance would provide. When the clearance was finally approved, I received a packet of materials that outlined my new role as a consultant to NASA's Mars exploration program, work that would involve direct contribution to engineering teams developing the most sophisticated spacecraft ever designed for interplanetary travel. The technical specifications I would be working with represented humanity's most ambitious plans for expanding our presence beyond Earth, mission architectures that would carry crews of astronauts to establish permanent research stations on the Martian surface. My first classified briefing at Johnson Space Center revealed the full scope of NASA's Mars exploration timeline, mission plans that extended decades into the future and encompassed not just scientific research but the establishment of sustainable human settlements on another planet. The atmospheric entry systems I would be helping to design weren't just for single missions but for an expanding program of exploration that would transform humanity into a multiplanetary species. Dr. Lisa Park, the lead engineer for atmospheric entry systems, explained how my computational modeling work would integrate with broader mission design efforts involving life support systems, habitat construction, and resource utilization technologies that would enable long-term human presence on Mars. The complexity of the engineering challenges was staggering, requiring coordination between dozens of specialized teams working on every aspect of interplanetary travel and planetary surface operations. Your atmospheric modeling expertise addresses one of our most critical knowledge gaps, she told me during our initial meeting. The entry dynamics for crewed vehicles are significantly more complex than anything we've dealt with for robotic missions, and your research is providing insights that could determine whether our landing systems achieve the reliability required for human safety. The weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and sobering. The mathematical models I was developing wouldn't just influence mission success rates but could affect the safety of astronauts whose lives would depend on systems operating perfectly in an environment where repair or rescue was impossible. Every line of code I wrote, every simulation I ran, every analysis I completed, was part of a process that would ultimately enable humans to walk on the surface of another world. Working within the classified mission planning environment revealed the true scale of America's commitment to Mars exploration, resources and technological development that far exceeded anything that had been publicly disclosed. The missions being planned would deploy multiple spacecraft, establish permanent infrastructure, and support crews that would remain on Mars for years rather than months. My atmospheric modeling work became increasingly central to mission planning as the complexity of the engineering challenges became apparent. The traditional approach of developing entry systems for single payload missions was inadequate for the large-scale infrastructure deployment that permanent Mars settlements would require. The models I was creating had to account for atmospheric interactions involving multiple simultaneous vehicle entries, coordinated landing sequences, and precision targeting that would enable delivered cargo to be integrated into expanding surface operations. During my second summer working with the classified mission development teams, Dr. Park approached me about a permanent position with NASA's Mars exploration program, an offer that would transition me from consulting work to full integration into the engineering teams responsible for humanity's expansion into the solar system. Your modeling work has become essential to our mission planning, she explained during a meeting that would change my life forever. We're not just looking for someone to provide occasional technical input. We need someone who can lead atmospheric systems development for the next generation of Mars missions, taking responsibility for engineering decisions that will enable human crews to safely reach and return from another planet. The position would require relocating to Houston permanently, completing my doctoral dissertation while working full-time on mission development, and accepting responsibility for technical systems that would carry astronauts on the most dangerous journey humans had ever attempted. It represented everything I had been working towards since that devastating science fair comment 13 years earlier, validation that the girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science was being invited to lead engineering development for humanity's greatest adventure. My phone call home to share news about the permanent NASA position produced reactions that encompassed the full range of emotions my family had experienced throughout my academic journey. Dad's response revealed both profound pride and deep concern about the magnitude of responsibility I was accepting. "They want you to move to Houston and work on the Mars missions permanently?" he asked, his voice carrying amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Sarah, that's incredible, but are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure? These are real missions with astronauts' lives at stake." Michael's reaction was unequivocally positive, reflecting his engineering background and his understanding of what the NASA position represented professionally. "This is huge, Sarah," he said, genuine excitement evident in his voice. "You've basically made it to the top of aerospace engineering. NASA doesn't offer permanent positions to people unless they're absolutely certain about their capabilities." Jennifer's response was filled with wonder and pride that revealed she finally understood the magnitude of what I had achieved. "My sister is going to work at NASA and help send people to Mars," she said, her voice filled with amazement. "I can't even process how incredible that is. Everyone I know is going to be so impressed." Mom's reaction encompassed the complex emotions of a parent watching her child achieve something beyond her wildest dreams, while simultaneously venturing into territory that felt both wonderful and terrifying. "I'm so proud of you I can barely speak," she said through tears. "But I'm also scared about you taking on so much responsibility. Promise me you'll be careful and remember that your family loves you no matter what." Their reactions revealed how completely my trajectory had exceeded every expectation anyone in Millbrook had ever held for what someone from our background could achieve. The girl who had been dismissed as not smart enough for space science was being entrusted with engineering systems that would enable humanity to become a multiplanetary species. 3 months later, I found myself back in the sterile white corridors of Johnson Space Center, this time not as an intern or consultant but as a permanent member of the team developing atmospheric entry systems for crewed Mars missions. My office overlooked the facility where astronauts trained for missions that would carry them further from Earth than any human had ever traveled, and my work contributed directly to engineering systems that would make those missions possible. The culmination came on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Park called me into her office with news that would validate every choice I had made since high school. NASA was announcing the crew selection for the first crewed mission to Mars, and the atmospheric entry systems I had helped design would carry those astronauts safely to the Martian surface and back to Earth. "Your modeling work was instrumental in developing the entry capabilities that made crew selection possible," she told me, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched a promising student become an accomplished professional. "Without the atmospheric dynamics analysis you provided, we wouldn't have had confidence in our ability to land crews safely on Mars." As I stood in that office, looking out at the facility where humanity's greatest adventure was being planned and developed, I thought about the girl who had stood before a science fair display 13 years earlier, hearing her father say she wasn't smart enough for space science. That girl's dreams had seemed impossible to everyone who knew her, but her determination had proved stronger than their doubts. The phone call I made to my family that evening carried news that would redefine everything they thought they knew about what their daughter had been working toward all these years. "Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to share. "I need to tell you something about the work I've been doing at NASA. Tomorrow, they're announcing the crew for the first human mission to Mars. The atmospheric entry systems that will carry those astronauts safely to Mars and back to Earth? I designed them." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Dad finally spoke, his voice carried wonder, pride, and the dawning recognition that his daughter had achieved something he had never imagined possible. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. 13 years ago, I told you that you weren't smart enough for space science. I was wrong. You weren't just smart enough. You were brilliant enough to help send humans to another planet." The conversation that followed encompassed years of misunderstanding, love, fear, and pride, as my family finally grasped the magnitude of what I had been working toward throughout my academic career. The girl they had worried about, the daughter whose ambitions had seemed unrealistic, the student whose dreams had appeared too big for someone from their background, had become the engineer whose work would enable humanity's expansion into the solar system. That night, alone in my Houston apartment, I looked up at the same stars that had captured my imagination during those long evenings on our back porch in Millbrook. The difference was that now I wasn't just dreaming about reaching those distant worlds. I was part of the team that was making those dreams reality, contributing work that would carry human beings to Mars and establish our species as citizens of the solar system rather than residents of a single planet. The journey from that devastating science fair comment to this moment had required 13 years of proving that intelligence, determination, and hard work could overcome any limitation that background or circumstance might impose. The girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science had become the woman whose engineering work would enable humanity's greatest adventure. Tomorrow, NASA would announce to the world that human beings were going to Mars. And the atmospheric entry systems that would carry them safely there had been designed by a girl from Millbrook, Ohio, who had refused to believe that her dreams were too big for someone like her to achieve. The transformation in my family's understanding didn't happen overnight, but rather unfolded gradually, as the reality of my achievements penetrated the protective barriers they had built around their expectations. Dad's initial response to learning that I had designed critical systems for the Mars mission was a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something that resembled grief for the years he had spent underestimating his own daughter's potential. In the weeks following that revelation, our phone conversations took on a completely different character. Instead of gentle warnings about practical career choices and concerns about my ambitious goals, Dad began asking detailed questions about my work that revealed a genuine hunger to understand what I was actually accomplishing. He started researching Mars exploration on his own, reading articles about NASA's mission plans, and calling me with informed questions about atmospheric entry systems and spacecraft design. "I've been thinking about what you told me," he said during one of these transformed conversations, his voice carrying a weight of reflection that I had never heard before. "I realize now that when I said you weren't smart enough for space science, I wasn't really talking about your abilities at all. I was talking about my own limitations, my own inability to imagine someone from our family achieving something so extraordinary." The acknowledgement meant more to me than any professional recognition I had received, because it represented genuine understanding rather than grudging acceptance. Dad wasn't just admitting he had been wrong about my capabilities. He was recognizing that his limitations had never been mine, and that the protective boundaries he had tried to establish around my ambitions had been based on his own fears rather than any realistic assessment of what I could achieve. Michael's evolution was perhaps even more dramatic, as his engineering background allowed him to fully grasp the technical significance of what I had accomplished. He began reaching out to colleagues in his own field, sharing news about his sister's work at NASA with a pride that bordered on evangelical enthusiasm. The brother who had once cautioned me about the impracticality of aerospace engineering was now researching the technical specifications of Mars missions and asking me questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension of the complexity involved. "I need to apologize for all those times I suggested you were being unrealistic," he said during a visit to Houston where I gave him a tour of Johnson Space Center's facilities. "I was measuring your potential against what I thought was possible for someone from our background, instead of recognizing that you were operating at a completely different level than anything I had experience with." Walking him through the laboratories where atmospheric entry systems were tested, showing him the wind tunnels where Martian conditions were simulated, and explaining how the mathematical models I had developed translated into hardware that would carry astronauts to another planet, I watched his expression shift from polite interest to genuine amazement. The brother who had worried about my career prospects was seeing firsthand that I had achieved something beyond what either of us had imagined possible when we were growing up in Millbrook. Jennifer's reaction was characteristically enthusiastic, but also revealed a depth of understanding that surprised me. She had always been supportive, but now her questions demonstrated that she had been researching space exploration extensively, trying to comprehend the full scope of what her sister was contributing to humanity's expansion beyond Earth. "I've been reading everything I can find about Mars missions," she told me during one of our conversations, "and I'm starting to understand that what you're doing isn't just a job or even a career. You're part of something that will be remembered as one of the most important achievements in human history." Her perspective helped me see my own work from a broader historical context. The technical challenges that consumed my daily attention were components of an endeavor that would fundamentally change humanity's relationship with the universe, expanding our presence beyond the single planet where our species had evolved, and establishing us as citizens of the solar system rather than residents of Earth alone. Mom's response encompassed the full emotional complexity of a parent whose child had exceeded every expectation, while simultaneously pursuing goals that remained somewhat frightening in their magnitude. Her pride was evident, but it was accompanied by a maternal concern about the weight of responsibility I was carrying, and the pressure that came with contributing to missions where human lives would depend on the systems I was designing. "I'm proud of you beyond words," she told me during a visit to Houston where she saw my office and met some of my colleagues. "But I also worry about you carrying so much responsibility. When I watch the news about Mars missions, I think about my daughter's work making it all possible, and it's both wonderful and terrifying." Her emotional response helped me understand the personal costs that had accompanied my professional achievements. The intensive focus required for doctoral research and classified mission development had left little time for the kinds of personal relationships and life experiences that my parents had hoped I would prioritize. While my career was flourishing beyond anyone's wildest expectations, other aspects of my life remained underdeveloped in ways that concerned those who loved me. The broader recognition of my work began extending beyond my immediate family as news of my role in Mars mission development became known in Millbrook. Dr. Rodriguez, my high school physics teacher, who had first encouraged my interest in space exploration, reached out with congratulations that carried the deep satisfaction of a mentor who had recognized potential that others had missed. "I always knew you were capable of extraordinary things," she told me during a phone call that brought tears to my eyes. "But even I couldn't have imagined that the student who researched Martian soil composition for a high school science fair would grow up to design the systems that carry humans to Mars." Her validation was particularly meaningful because it connected my current achievements to the foundational experiences that had shaped my scientific interests. The curiosity and analytical thinking that had driven my high school research had evolved into professional expertise that was contributing to humanity's greatest adventure. But the underlying passion remained unchanged from those early days when I had spent hours in her classroom learning about the physics that governed planetary exploration. The science fair where Dad had delivered his devastating assessment became a different kind of memory as my professional achievements provided new context for that formative experience. What had once been a source of pain and self-doubt was now evidence of how completely wrong people could be when they measured potential against their own limited expectations, rather than recognizing genuine capability. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same research topic that had prompted Dad's dismissive comment, Martian atmospheric dynamics, had become the foundation for the most important work of my professional career. The girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science had grown up to become the engineer whose atmospheric modeling expertise was enabling humanity's expansion to Mars. My return visits to Millbrook took on a surreal quality as the community that had once viewed my ambitions as unrealistic struggled to process the reality of what I had achieved. The local newspaper ran a feature story about my work at NASA, complete with photographs from my high school science fair project and quotes from teachers who remembered my intense interest in space exploration. The article prompted responses from community members who had witnessed my father's science fair comment years earlier, many of whom reached out with apologies for not speaking up at the time, or recognition that they had underestimated what someone from their small town could accomplish. The pattern of retroactive support was both gratifying and frustrating, highlighting how readily people revised their assessments once success was undeniable. Lou's Diner, the local gathering place where family discussions had often centered around concerns about my impractical career choices, became a venue for showcasing my achievements to anyone who would listen. Dad would bring newspaper clippings about Mars missions, explaining to anyone who would hear that his daughter had designed critical systems that made the missions possible. The transformation in how my family presented my career to their social circles reflected their growing understanding of what I had actually accomplished. Instead of the apologetic explanations that had once characterized their descriptions of my academic pursuits, they now spoke with pride that bordered on boastfulness about their daughter's role in humanity's expansion to Mars. But perhaps the most significant change was in how my achievements influenced their perspectives on education and ambition more broadly. Michael began encouraging his own children to pursue challenging academic goals without worrying about whether their interests seemed practical or achievable. Jennifer started volunteering with local STEM education programs, sharing my story as an example of what was possible when young people were encouraged to pursue their passions, regardless of background or circumstances. Dad's evolution was the most profound, as his experience of being completely wrong about my potential led him to reconsider how he evaluated students' capabilities in his own classroom. He began identifying students whose interests and aptitudes suggested they might benefit from encouragement to pursue ambitious goals, rather than automatically steering them towards safe, conventional career paths. "I realize now that I was doing exactly what I did to you with some of my students," he admitted during one of our conversations. "I was measuring their potential against what I thought was realistic for kids from Millbrook, instead of recognizing that some of them might be capable of achieving things I couldn't even imagine." His recognition that geographic location and family background were limitations that could be overcome rather than permanent constraints represented a fundamental shift in how he approached both teaching and parenting. The man who had once cautioned me against unrealistic ambitions was now encouraging young people to pursue their most challenging dreams. The broader impact extended beyond my immediate family to influence how Millbrook as a community thought about education and opportunity. My achievements became a reference point for discussions about what young people from small towns could accomplish if they were given appropriate encouragement and support, rather than being steered toward conventionally safe career paths. Dr. Rodriguez established a scholarship program in my name, providing funding for Millbrook students who wanted to pursue STEM education at competitive universities. The scholarship criteria specifically recognized students whose interests might seem impractical or overly ambitious, ensuring that future generations wouldn't face the same automatic discouragement that had characterized my early academic experience. The scholarship announcement brought me back to Millbrook for a ceremony that felt like both vindication and reconciliation. Standing in the same community center where my science fair project had been dismissed 13 years earlier, I addressed an audience that included many of the same people who had witnessed Dad's devastating comment about my capabilities. When I was 16, I presented a research project about Martian soil composition in this very room, I told the assembled crowd, my voice carrying confidence that would have been impossible during that earlier experience. Someone I loved very much told me that day that I wasn't smart enough for space science. He was wrong, but his error wasn't malicious. It came from loving concern and a desire to protect me from disappointment. I looked directly at Dad, who was sitting in the front row with tears streaming down his face. What that person didn't understand was that intelligence isn't limited by geography or background or other people's expectations. The same curiosity and determination that drove my high school research eventually led to professional work designing atmospheric entry systems for the first crewed mission to Mars. The response from the audience was overwhelming, but more important was the conversation with Dad that followed the ceremony. Walking through the streets where I had grown up, past the house where I had spent hours staring at the stars through a garage sale telescope, we talked about dreams, limitations, and the courage required to pursue goals that others might consider impossible. "I've learned something important from watching your journey," he said as we stood in front of our old house. "The biggest limitations we face aren't usually external. They're the assumptions we make about what's possible for people like us, coming from places like this. You proved that those assumptions are often wrong." The reconciliation was complete, but it was also transformative in ways that extended far beyond our personal relationship. Dad's public acknowledgement of his error, and his celebration of my achievements, sent a message to the entire community about the importance of supporting ambitious young people, rather than automatically tempering their expectations. The ripple effects continued as local schools began incorporating space science education into their curricula, exposing students to the same kinds of research opportunities that had captured my imagination in high school. Dr. Rodriguez's scholarship program attracted applications from students whose interests spanned everything from theoretical physics to astrobiology. young people who might previously have been discouraged from pursuing such specialized fields. My own role in these educational initiatives evolved from inspiration to active participation, as I began visiting schools throughout Ohio, sharing my story and encouraging students to pursue challenging academic goals regardless of their backgrounds or the skepticism they might encounter from well-meaning adults. The girl who designed atmospheric entry systems for Mars missions grew up right here in Ohio, I would tell these audiences, in a town where space exploration seemed as remote and impossible as any fantasy. The difference between achieving your dreams and abandoning them isn't your starting point. It's your willingness to keep working toward goals that others might consider unrealistic. These speaking engagements brought me into contact with young people whose circumstances reminded me of my own high school experience. Students whose interests in science and technology were being met with gentle discouragement from adults who wanted to protect them from disappointment. The conversations that followed my presentations often revealed talented young people who had been slowly persuaded to lower their expectations, rather than being encouraged to develop their capabilities. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. Bright students whose curiosity and aptitude were being channeled towards safe, conventional goals rather than the challenging pursuits that might actually match their potential. The same protective instincts that had led Dad to warn me against space science were steering other young people away from the fields where they might make their greatest contributions. My response was to create a mentorship network that connected ambitious students with professionals working in cutting-edge fields, providing the kind of guidance and encouragement that had been so crucial during my own academic development. The program paired young people with scientists, engineers, and researchers who could help them navigate the path from small-town curiosity to professional achievement in competitive technical fields. The success stories that emerged from this mentorship network validated everything I had learned about the importance of appropriate guidance and encouragement during critical developmental periods. Students who might have been steered toward conventional career paths were instead pursuing doctoral programs at prestigious universities, conducting research that could contribute to major scientific breakthroughs, and demonstrating that geographic origin was no barrier to intellectual achievement. One particularly memorable success involved a student from rural Kentucky, whose interest in astrobiology had been dismissed by her guidance counselor as impractical and unrealistic. Through our mentorship program, she connected with researchers at major universities who helped her develop the academic preparation necessary for competitive graduate programs. She eventually completed a PhD at Caltech and joined the team searching for signs of life on Mars, contributing expertise that could help answer one of humanity's most fundamental questions. Her story reminded me that my own journey from Millbrook to NASA wasn't unique in its potential, but rather in the combination of circumstances that had allowed me to overcome the discouragement that might have derailed my ambitions. How many other young people had faced similar dismissal of their dreams without access to mentors who could help them persist through doubt and skepticism? The question motivated me to expand the mentorship program nationally, creating connections between students in underserved communities and professionals whose achievements demonstrated that background didn't determine potential. The program's success attracted attention from educational foundations and government agencies interested in developing talent that might otherwise go unrecognized. 5 years after that transformative phone call home, I found myself standing once again in Conference Room Alpha 7 at Johnson Space Center, but this time as the lead engineer for atmospheric entry systems rather than a nervous consultant hoping to contribute useful work. The folder in my hands contained final mission specifications for the crewed Mars expedition that would launch within the next 18 months, carrying 6 astronauts on humanity's first journey to establish a permanent research station on another planet. The atmospheric entry systems that would carry those astronauts safely to the Martian surface represented the culmination of everything I had been working toward since that devastating science fair comment 15 years earlier. The mathematical models I had developed, the simulation software I had created, and the engineering solutions I had contributed would enable human beings to step onto the surface of Mars and begin the next chapter of our species' expansion into the cosmos. But perhaps more importantly, the journey from that moment of dismissal to this moment of achievement had taught me that the biggest limitations we face are often the ones we accept, rather than the ones that actually exist. The girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science had proven that intelligence, determination, and appropriate support could overcome any barrier that circumstances or background might impose. As I reviewed the final mission specifications, I thought about all the young people who were currently facing their own versions of that science fair moment, being told that their dreams were too big, their goals too ambitious, their backgrounds too limiting for the achievements they envisioned. My story had become their proof that such discouragement was often wrong, that the distance between small-town curiosity and professional achievement in the most challenging fields was measurable in years of focused effort, rather than insurmountable barriers. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection, and I answered to hear Dad's voice carrying excitement that had become characteristic of our conversations since that transformative revelation 5 years earlier. "Sarah, I just saw the news about the mission launch date," he said, pride evident in every word. 18 months from now, astronauts will be traveling to Mars using systems you designed. I still can't quite believe it, but I'm learning to accept that my daughter achieved something I never thought possible." The conversation that followed encompassed everything our relationship had become since he acknowledged his error about my potential. Instead of concern about impractical career choices, he expressed genuine interest in the technical challenges that remained to be solved before launch. Instead of warnings about unrealistic ambitions, he shared news about students in his own classes who were pursuing challenging academic goals with his encouragement rather than his skepticism. "I've been thinking about that science fair again," he said as our conversation was drawing to a close. "I realize now that when I told you that you weren't smart enough for space science, I wasn't protecting you from disappointment. I was limiting you based on my own inability to imagine what you were capable of achieving." The acknowledgement had evolved from apology to understanding, recognition that the most dangerous limitations are often the ones imposed by people who love us but can't envision the full scope of our potential. His error hadn't been malicious, but it had nearly derailed a career that would contribute to humanity's expansion beyond Earth. "The important thing," I replied, "is that we both learned something from that experience. You learned not to underestimate people based on your own limitations, and I learned that other people's doubts don't have to define what's possible for my own life." That evening, alone in my Houston apartment, I looked up at the same stars that had captured my imagination during those long nights in Millbrook. The difference was that now I wasn't just dreaming about reaching those distant worlds. I was part of the team that was making those dreams reality, contributing work that would carry human beings to Mars and establish our species as citizens of the solar system. The journey from that devastating science fair comment to this moment had required 15 years of proving that intelligence, determination, and hard work could overcome any limitation that background or circumstance might impose. The girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for space science had become the woman whose engineering work would enable humanity's greatest adventure. In 18 months, 6 astronauts would climb aboard a spacecraft and begin the journey to Mars, trusting their lives to atmospheric entry systems I had designed. When they stepped onto the Martian surface and began establishing humanity's first permanent foothold on another world, they would be proving that the dreams dismissed as impossible in a small-town community center were actually the foundation for achievements that would echo throughout human history. The girl from Millbrook had kept her promise to the stars, and the stars were finally ready to welcome humanity home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.